Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, New Senegal, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine.
Back in April 1990, and in a nightclub, I ran into a Senegalese research computational physicist. He had left Senegal for Paris, France, and came to US after several years in Paris. We were drinking beer at the same table when I discovered his background as a computational physicist, and he discovered my background as the only extreme-scale computational physicist that was computing across a new internet that was a global network of 65,536 processors. The Senegalese computational physicist was shocked to learn that a fellow West African research mathematical physicist had experimentally discovered the new supercomputer knowledge of how to build new supercomputers that will be powered by an ensemble of commodity off-the-shelf processors. He said in amazement, "I've heard of parallel processing, but thought it was science fiction." It was surreal to him that he left Dakar, Senegal, West Africa, and went to Paris, France, to learn computational physics. Here he is in a nightclub in the United States and learning extreme-scale computational physics and learning the massively parallel processing supercomputer and learning the technology directly from the primary source and from a person that also grew up in West Africa, and learning the technology from the Nigerian that experimentally invented the massively parallel processing supercomputer. The Senegalese research computational physicist described himself as the first student of the first person that experimentally discovered how to make computers faster and how to make supercomputers fastest and how to use that new knowledge to build new supercomputers. We noted that almost 3 weeks earlier, and on February 11, 1990, that Nelson Mandela had walked out of prison. It was 8 p.m. Friday, April 20, 1990. My voice was hoarse from giving my first marathon daily media interviews on my experimental discovery of massively parallel processing. Those daily media interviews continued non-stop, and for the past 8 weeks, and since I won the top prize in supercomputing, I began giving media interviews on my experimental discovery and from the then Cathedral Hill Hotel in San Francisco, California, and on February 28, 1990. My first media interviews took place at the International Computer Conference of February 26, 1990 through March 2nd, 1990. That computer conference was the largest computer conference and was organized by the Computer Society of the IEEE, the acronym for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. The experimental discovery of massively parallel processing that I was being interviewed about occurred on the 4th of July of 1989. But to my interviewers, that discovery did not occur a year earlier, but occurred yesterday. Back in 1989, that discovery sounded like science fiction instead of the scientific discovery that it was. So here I was in a nightclub at 8 p.m. Friday, April 20, 1990. I was training my voice to be heard over the loud extended mix and remix of the 1987 dancehall hit song Yeke Yeke by More Kante, the Guinean vocalist and player of the kora harp. I continued my geek conversation with the Senegalese computational physicist that was sharing my table. Using the language of a supercomputer scientist, I said to the Senegalese research physicist, quote, I achieved nearest neighbor emailing by using a naming scheme that's binary reflected. It will take 1,000 hours to recite the names of all my 65,536 commodity processors. Just name 8 processors, the Senegalese physicist pleaded. Consider 8 processors that are equal distances afar and apart, I said, and that are on the surface of a globe that are married together as a global network of 8 processors, and that define and outline both a new internet and a parallel processing supercomputer computing with 8 processing nodes. And I continued. I visualized my email wires as the 24 bidirectional edges of the cube, and I visualized those 8 processors as placed in the positions of the 8 vertices of the cube that I visualized as tightly circumscribed by a globe. For my 65,536 processors, I communicated across higher spatial dimensions, and I sent and received emails by visualizing the hypercube in a 16-dimensional universe or hyperspace. I visualized my hypercube as tightly circumscribed by the hypersphere or the hyperglobe and in the same 16-dimensional hyperspace. I rephrased my 16-dimensional email communication problem as follows. How do I walk along the bidirectional email wires and pausing only once at each computer? Doing so is equivalent to my discovering the nearest neighbor mapping of my one-dimensional mesh onto all 65,536 commodity processors that are equal distances afar and apart from each other. That was how I emailed 8 petroleum reservoir codes. Each code an initial boundary value problem that represented 8 adjacent production oil fields. It's counterintuitive, but my directly connected petroleum reservoirs were mapped onto directly connected commodity processors that simultaneously had different 3-bit long identification numbers that uniquely identified 8 directly connected processors and 8 contiguous blocks of oil fields that were also directly connected. I experimentally discovered how to parallel process across a new internet that is a global network of processors. I experimentally discovered parallel processing in the following 8 steps for my 8 processors. And I extended that algorithm to my 65,536 steps for my as many processors. First, I synchronously emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 0 to the processor I named 0. Second, I synchronously emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 1 to the processor I named 1. Third, I synchronously emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 2 to the processor I named 3, and not email it to the processor I named 2. For this processor, my email addressing was counterintuitive and unconventional. My parallel processing experiment was counterintuitive because I emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 2 to processor 3 within my ensemble of processors. It was intuitive and conventional to email my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 2 to processor 2 and to email my code as taught from the supercomputer textbooks of 1989 and earlier. Fourth, I synchronously emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 3 to the processor I named 2. Here my email addressing is counterintuitive and unconventional because I emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 3 to processor 2 instead of the intuitive and conventional emailing of computer code 3 to processor 3. Fifth, I synchronously emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 4 to the processor I named 6. Here my email addressing is counterintuitive and unconventional because I emailed from computer code 4 to processor 6 instead of the intuitive and conventional emailing of computer code 4 to processor 4. Sixth, I synchronously emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 5 to the processor I named 7. Here, my email addressing is counterintuitive and unconventional because I emailed computer code 5 to processor 7 instead of the intuitive and conventional emailing from computer code 5 to processor 5. Seventh, I synchronously emailed the petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 6 to the processor I named 5. Here, my email addressing is counterintuitive and unconventional because I emailed my petroleum reservoir simulation code that I named 6 to the processor that I named 5 instead of the counterintuitive and conventional emailing of code 6 to processor 6. 8. I synchronously emailed my petroleum reservoir code for oil field number 7 to the processor that I named 4. Here, my email addressing is counterintuitive and unconventional because I emailed the computer code that I named 7 to the processor that I named 4 instead of the intuitive and conventional emailing of code 7 to processor 7. I extended this one-to-one mapping algorithm from the 3rd dimension through the 16th dimension. In the 16th dimension, I synchronously emailed my 2 raised to power 16 or 65,536 petroleum reservoir simulation codes for 64 binary 1,000 oil fields to 65,536 processors that I uniquely named by 65,536 unique strings of 16 zeros and ones. In the 16th dimension, my email addressing was counterintuitive and unconventional because I emailed my computer codes to the processors that I named differently instead of the intuitive and conventional emailing of computer codes to processors that were correspondingly named. My code to processor mappings preserved nearest neighbor connectivity and did so with a 1-to-1 correspondence between my 64 binary 1,000 codes and my as many processors. That 1-to-1 nearest neighbor mapping was at the granite core of how I theoretically and experimentally discovered how and why parallel processing makes computers faster and makes supercomputers fastest, and for me to experimentally invent how and why to use that new supercomputer knowledge that encircled to build a new supercomputer that encircled a globe and encircled it in the manner the internet encircled a globe. I experimentally discovered the fastest parallel processing supercomputer, and I discovered it as a new internet, and I discovered it at the crossroad of processor to processor email messaging, and I discovered it at the crossroads between nearest neighboring petroleum reservoir simulation codes that I executed within nearest neighboring processors of an ensemble of 65,536 processors that were the building blocks of a new supercomputer.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.